Just off Interstate 44, about a half hour southwest of St. Louis, there's a quiet little state park, a visitor center, and an old white roadhouse, a walking trail by the Merrimack River, a picnic or two. The building is real Route 66 history, a roadhouse from 1935. But here's the thing nobody tells you as you walk in. That roadhouse is the last building of an entire American town. A town of more than 2,000 people that was bought, evacuated, fenced off, and burned to the ground on purpose by the government. You are standing in the one thing left of Times Beach, Missouri. And how it got erased is one of the strangest, most important stories this state has ever produced. Let's start with the name, because it tells you everything about how this town began, and it has nothing to do with a beach. Back in 1925, a St. Louis newspaper called the Star-Times had a promotion. They bought a triangle of cheap land on the floodplain of the Merrimack River, out past Eureka, right along the brand new Route 66. And they sold it off in tiny lots, about $67 a lot, $10 down. And if you bought one, you got a 6-month subscription to the newspaper thrown in. That's the whole origin. Times Beach is named after the Star-Times. It was a newspaper gimmick to sell riverfront weekend lots. And it worked. People built little summer cabins, then year-round homes, and by the 1970s, Times Beach was a modest, working-class town of a couple thousand people. It had one nagging problem. Most of its roads were dirt. And in the summer, the dust was miserable, coating the houses, the cars, the laundry on the line. The town couldn't afford to pave. So they did what a lot of small towns did back then. They hired someone to spray the roads with waste oil to keep the dust down. The someone was a man named Russell Bliss. Bliss ran a waste hauling business, and spraying oil on dirt roads was a cheap, common service. Between about 1972 and 1976, he sprayed something like 160,000 gallons of oil across the roads of Times Beach. And this is where an ordinary story becomes a nightmare. Because the oil Russell Bliss was spraying wasn't just oil. To understand what was in it, you have to drive southwest to a chemical plant in the town of Verona, Missouri. There, a company called Napaco, the Northeastern Pharmaceutical and Chemical Company, had been manufacturing hexachlorophene, a germ-killing chemical used in soaps. That manufacturing process runs through the same family of chemistry used to produce the wartime defoliant, Agent Orange. And like that process, it produced a waste byproduct, a thick sludge left at the bottom of the tanks. That sludge was contaminated with a chemical called dioxin, specifically 2378-TCDD. And dioxin is not an ordinary poison. It's considered one of the most toxic synthetic compounds ever created. It causes a disfiguring skin condition called chloracne. It's classified as a known human carcinogen. It doesn't break down, and it builds up in body fat so the damage can surface years later. It is exactly the kind of thing you never, ever want sprayed onto the ground where children play. The waste from that plant got handed down a chain of contractors until it reached Russell Bliss, who mixed it into his oil and sprayed it for years onto the roads of Times Beach and dozens of other Missouri sites. Now here's the part that should have been the warning. It came more than a decade early, and nobody understood it. Because before anyone worried about the people, the horses started dying. In 1971, a full year before the Times Beach spraying even began, Bliss sprayed his oil at a horse arena called Shenandoah Stables, up near Moscow Mills, to keep down the dust. Within weeks, the animals began to sicken. 62 horses died or had to be put down. Birds dropped, cats, dogs, rodents. A young girl who'd been playing in the arena ended up hospitalized. Something in that oil was killing everything it touched. But it would take 11 years and a lot of dead animals across Missouri before investigators finally traced the poison back to its source and realized where else that same oil had been sprayed. Which brings us to December of 1982 and the single worst weekend in the history of Times Beach, because two disasters hit it at almost the exact same time. On Friday, December 3rd, federal EPA investigators were in Times Beach, taking soil samples from the roads, following the Dioxin trail. Their results would come back, showing contamination up to about 300 times the level health officials considered safe. And that very same weekend, December 4th and 5th, the Merrimack River rose and flooded the town. Not a small flood, one of the worst in its history, cresting more than 14 feet above flood stage. The water rolled over those poisoned dirt roads and spread the contaminated soil across the whole community, into homes, into yards. So the residents of Times Beach evacuated for the flood, and a few weeks later, on December 23rd, 2 days before Christmas, the Centers for Disease Control delivered the verdict. Times Beach was uninhabitable. The people who had fled the water should not come back. Imagine that. You evacuate your home because of a flood, and while you're gone, the government tells you the ground itself is poison and you can never return. So what do you do with an entire town that can't be lived in? In February of 1983, the head of the EPA announced a decision that had never been made before in American history. The federal government would buy Times Beach. Not a few houses, all of it. 800 homes and 30 businesses. The total came to about $36.7 million, most of it, $33 million, paid by the federal government under the brand new Superfund program. It was the first time the United States ever bought out and relocated an entire community because of toxic contamination. More than 2,000 people took the checks and left. And in 1985, the governor of Missouri signed an order that did the final thing. He dissolved the town. Times Beach, Missouri, legally ceased to exist. For the next 14 years, it sat there, fenced off, quarantined. A ghost town on Route 66 with empty streets and a chain-link fence and signs warning you to stay out. And then Missouri did something with it that you would not expect. They cleaned it. In 1996 and 1997, crews built a temporary incinerator right on the site and burned the contaminated soil at extremely high heat to destroy the dioxin. The tainted dirt from Times Beach itself, about 37,000 tons of it, went into that furnace. When it was done, the ground was tested and retested and finally declared safe. And in 1999, the fences came down and the land reopened, not as a town, as Route 66 State Park, more than 400 acres of trails and river frontage along the old highway. 2 years later, it was taken off the nation's list of the most contaminated sites entirely. Which leaves that quiet visitor center we started with, the 1935 Roadhouse. It opened as the Bridgehead Inn, later became Steiny's Inn, and somehow survived everything. The poison, the flood, the buyout, the fire, the erasure. Today it's a little museum. You can walk inside the last standing building of a town that no longer exists and read the whole story on the walls. There's something Missouri seems to keep doing. Down in the old lead country, they turned 100 years of toxic mine tailings into St. Joe State Park. And here, on Route 66, they took a town so poisoned it had to be burned and turned it into a park too. It's a strange kind of hope. It doesn't undo what happened. 62 horses still died. 2,000 people still lost their homes and their town for good. But the land, in the end, came back. The river still runs. People walk the trail where the streets used to be. And the only way you'd ever know a whole town was erased right under your feet is to step inside one old roadhouse, the last piece of Times Beach, still standing on the Mother Road.